When the winters of World War II arrived, cold became as dangerous as bullets. Families huddled in broken houses, soldiers dug into frozen ground, and refugees crossed icy roads with nothing but scraps for shelter. There was no central heating, no endless fuel supply, no guarantee of fire, yet they found ways to keep warmth alive. Bricks that stored heat through the night, homemade stoves welded from scrap metal, pipes filled with hot sand and sealed beneath blankets. These weren't luxuries. They were the thin line between survival and collapse. And almost all of them have been erased from memory, because when systems fail, when firewood runs out, and when silence is safer than smoke, these are the methods that still work. Subscribe now, because the wisdom that kept millions alive may be the same knowledge you'll one day depend on. Number 1. Heated pebble bedding. During the freezing winters of World War II, when coal deliveries stopped and wood piles disappeared, civilians and soldiers turned to the ground beneath their feet for warmth. Pebbles, so ordinary and overlooked, became lifesavers once they were understood as nature's heat batteries. The process was simple but effective. A sack of smooth river stones or handfuls of small pebbles were gathered, cleaned, and placed near a controlled fire or inside a stove until they absorbed the heat. Once hot, they were scooped into cloth bags wrapped in rags or bundled inside old socks. These improvised heat packs were then tucked beneath bedding, laid at the foot of makeshift mattresses, or held close to the body during sleep. Unlike burning fuel, which needed constant feeding, hot pebbles gave off steady, silent warmth for hours. In unheated barns, shattered houses, or outdoor encampments, they turned frigid nights into something survivable. Soldiers on watch rotations often shared pebble packs, one heating them by the fire while another carried them under coats to fight off frostbite. The technique worked because stone retains thermal energy better than most materials. A sack of warmed pebbles could radiate gentle heat until morning, especially if insulated under blankets or straw bedding. Families sometimes lined entire beds with heated stones beneath boards, creating a crude but effective thermal mattress. Of course, there were limits. If pebbles were overheated, they could scorch cloth or cause burns. Damp stones taken from rivers without drying sometimes cracked violently when heated too quickly. Knowledgeable families chose dry, dense stones and always wrapped them securely before use. And unlike fuel, they didn't produce new heat. They had to be reheated daily. Still, in the wartime blackouts of Europe, heated pebbles meant the difference between shivering endlessly and actually resting through the night. They cost nothing, required no precious fuel, and could be reused endlessly. What others saw as rubble, resourceful families saw it as warmth. This forgotten method reminds us that survival doesn't always demand fire. Sometimes it simply demands knowing how to turn the earth itself into a blanket. Number 2, boiling grain warm packs. In the winters of World War II, food and fuel were always in competition. If you burned grain as fuel, you went hungry. If you ate it cold, you froze through the night. Some families discovered a middle path. Boiling grains not only prepared a meal, but also created improvised heating packs that stayed hot for hours. Barley, oats, rye, and even wheat kernels were boiled until swollen with water. Once drained, the steaming grains were scooped into cloth sacks, tied tightly and used as portable heaters. Wrapped in rags or slipped beneath blankets, these packs radiated warmth long after the cooking fire had been extinguished. Soldiers on the march often carried warm sacks against their chests, letting body heat and food storage combine into one. Civilians placed them at the foot of beds so children could rest in comfort despite freezing rooms. The ingenuity of this method lay in its double purpose. The same grains that kept families warm at night could be eaten the next morning. By softening slowly within the bag, they were already partially cooked, needing only reheating or a pinch of salt to become breakfast. Nothing was wasted. Heat was borrowed first, then nutrition taken second. The packs were remarkably effective. A sack of boiled oats wrapped in cloth could remain warm for 3 to 4 hours, enough to bridge the coldest stretch of the night. Larger bags, sometimes sewn from old pillowcases, were buried under straw mattresses to radiate heat upward, turning crude bedding into something that resembled a heated pad. There were drawbacks. Wet sacks could leak if cloth tore, leaving damp patches in already miserable sleeping conditions. Grain had to be monitored carefully since overheating risked scorching, making both the pack and the food inedible. But with practice, families learned the right balance. Firm grains, boiled but not mushy, sealed tightly in strong cloth. This small act of thrift and adaptation highlights wartime resilience. The same handful of oats fought two battles, against hunger and against cold. In a world where every resource was stretched thin, nothing carried more value than something that could serve twice.
Number 3.
Clay tile wall radiators. When the bombings of World War II left homes shattered, many families found themselves living in half-ruined buildings, with broken windows, missing doors, and collapsed chimneys. Keeping warm became a daily battle. In some towns, survivors discovered an unlikely tool for heating: clay roofing tiles salvaged from rubble. Clay has an extraordinary ability to hold and release heat. Families collected cracked roof tiles, stacked them tightly against the walls of the one room they still lived in, and then heated them using small fires or glowing embers placed nearby. Once warmed, the tiles radiated heat for hours, slowly releasing it back into the room like primitive radiators. The thicker the tile, the longer the warmth lingered. This method didn't require much fuel, which made it invaluable. Like coal was rationed, wood scarce, and anything that stretched heat further meant survival. Tiles arranged in a dense stack became a thermal wall. Even if the fire went out, the mass of clay continued to give off warmth, keeping families from freezing during blackout nights when lighting fires was dangerous. In some cases, soldiers adapted the same technique in temporary shelters. They lined dugouts with clay tiles scavenged from ruined farmhouses, heating them by placing embers at the base. The tiles not only warmed the confined space, but also helped reduce dampness, drying the walls and creating a more livable environment. The method had limitations. Heating tiles took time and care. If exposed to sudden temperature changes, they could crack or shatter. Moving them while hot was difficult, requiring rags, improvised tongs, or careful handling. And unlike stoves, they couldn't produce continuous cooking heat. They were only radiant heaters. But for families with nothing else, they worked silently, effectively, and without waste. This system was more than survival. It was psychological. In a time when fear and hunger pressed in from every side, the gentle warmth radiating from tiles gave families a sense of stability. Even children, tucked against tile-warmed walls, could find a moment's comfort in the middle of chaos. Today, the principle hasn't disappeared entirely. In some rural areas, thick clay stoves and tiled walls still provide steady heat without electricity. Modern passive heating systems use the same logic. Dense material absorbs energy, then slowly releases it to stabilize temperature. For World War II survivors, these clay tile radiators weren't clever design choices, they were lifelines carved from ruins. What others saw as debris, they saw as the raw material of warmth. Would you stack broken tiles into heaters if it meant surviving the winter? Number 4. Coal dust briquettes. In the fuel-starved winters of World War II, coal was rationed so tightly that many households received barely enough to last a week. But in coal mining towns and bombed cities, something remained in abundance: coal dust. Normally useless and discarded, this fine black powder became the foundation for a hidden heating solution. Families gathered coal dust swept from rail yards, mines, and storage depots. Mixed with mud, straw, or even potato peelings, the dust was pressed into hand-shaped bricks or stuffed into tin molds. Once dried in the sun, or near a weak fire, these improvised briquettes became slow-burning fuel blocks. They didn't burn hot, but they burned long. Exactly what desperate homes needed. The strength of this method lay in its thrift. Where a small pile of coal might vanish in an hour, briquettes made from dust could smolder for half a day. Ashes were even reused, sifted for unburned fragments, and added back into the mixture to stretch supplies further. Nothing went to waste. Of course, the process had drawbacks. Wet briquettes crumbled, poorly mixed batches smoked heavily, and weak fires struggled to ignite them. Still, for families facing weeks of frost with empty coal bins, These crude blocks meant the difference between shivering in silence and having a steady, if modest, source of warmth. This forgotten wartime practice carried a larger lesson. Survival was never about perfection. It was about making something useful from scraps, transforming what the world discarded into a tool for life. Number 5. Soapstone pocket heaters. Among the ruins of World War II, civilians and soldiers learned that not all stones were equal. Some crumbled under heat, others cracked when placed near flame. But soapstone, soft, dense, and heat-retaining, became prized as one of the best natural heaters available. When found in quarries, fields, or broken masonry, small blocks of soapstone were collected, cleaned, and cut down to palm-sized pieces. Heated carefully in stoves or fires, the stones absorbed large amounts of energy, then released it slowly, staying warm for hours. Wrapped in rags, old socks, or scraps of cloth, they became portable heaters carried in pockets, tucked into boots, or held in hands on long, freezing nights. For civilians sheltering in damaged homes, soapstone blocks were placed under bedding to create radiant heat through the night. Soldiers tucked them inside coats or gloves while on watch, preventing frostbite and buying endurance in conditions where fire was unsafe. Unlike coals or embers, soapstone did not scorch fabric, making it safer to use close to the body. The advantage of soapstone lay in its stability. Unlike river stones, it rarely cracked when heated, and its density allowed it to hold warmth longer than brick or clay. A single stone, reheated daily, could serve a family for years without wearing down. Even when larger fires were impossible, a few minutes of exposure to embers could charge a stone with enough heat to offer comfort. Its limits were practical. Soapstone wasn't available everywhere, and heating it still required some fire or stove. But where it could be found, it was among the most reliable tools for personal warmth. This simple stone, forgotten by most today, turned pockets into hand warmers and ruined shelters into tolerable homes. It proved that survival sometimes depends not on complex inventions, but on recognizing the hidden strengths of the earth itself. On number 6, tin can chimney stoves. In the scattered camps and ruined villages of World War II, even a handful of twigs could mean survival. The challenge was how to burn them efficiently, with little smoke and maximum heat. The answer often came from the most overlooked wartime scrap: empty food tins. Soldiers and civilians learned to transform these cans into compact stoves. By stacking 2 or 3 tins, punching vent holes at the base, and cutting an opening at the side, they created a miniature chimney effect. Air was pulled in through the bottom vents, while heat rose upward, concentrating the flames in a narrow column. The result was a small but powerful fire that used minimal fuel. Twigs, dry grass, and even scraps of paper could be fed into the stove. Within minutes, the concentrated flames could heat water, warm food, or radiate enough warmth to thaw frozen hands. Its true strength, however, was in concealment. Unlike open fires, tin can stoves burned hotter and cleaner, producing less visible smoke, a critical advantage during blackouts or in hostile territory. Civilians built them in kitchens, stripped of coal. Soldiers carried dismantled versions in packs, reassembling them whenever fuel was scarce. Even children, left in shattered towns, learned the skill of turning discarded tins into a lifeline. With nothing more than a knife, a nail, or even a sharpened stone, they could punch holes and fashion a stove within minutes. The limitations were real. Thin metal warped under repeated heat, cans eventually rusted, and their small size meant frequent refueling. But the trade-off was worth it: efficiency, portability, and almost invisible flames. For people who lived in constant fear of being noticed, this simple design often meant the difference between warmth and exposure. Today, survivalists still replicate tin can chimney stoves under the name hobo stoves or rocket stoves. But during World War II, they weren't experiments. They were necessities, crafted from the waste of war to keep human endurance alive. Number 7. Charred wood insulation logs. In the harsh winters of World War II, wood was one of the most contested resources. Entire forests were stripped bare, and households often faced the bitter reality of running out of fuel long before spring. To make limited supplies last, many turned to an old but clever technique, charring logs to create insulation and extend burn time. The method was simple, born from necessity. Logs were placed near a low fire or rolled directly into hot embers until the outer layer blackened and hardened. This thin crust of char acted like insulation, slowing the rate at which the log burned when later used as fuel. A charred log might last twice as long as raw wood, smoldering slowly and releasing steady heat instead of flaring and vanishing quickly. Families adapted this method indoors as well. Charred logs were stacked along walls to trap daytime warmth, then shifted into stoves at night for extended heating. In rural villages where people still cooked on open hearths, partially charred wood was pulled from the fire before fully consumed, then set aside for reuse later. Nothing was wasted. Even half-burned logs became tools for survival. The process had other benefits too. Partially carbonized logs produced less smoke when reignited, an important advantage in blackout cities where visible fires could draw danger. Soldiers in the field also favored charred wood, carrying lighter, pre-burned pieces that ignited more easily than fresh timber. In wet conditions, this meant the difference between shivering through the night and having a steady flame. Of course, the technique required patience. Overchar too deeply, and the log became brittle, crumbling into ash before its time. Underchar, and the wood burned too quickly. It was a balancing act learned by practice, a quiet skill passed down within families, rarely spoken of, but often relied upon. This adaptation, now almost forgotten, reflects the wartime principle of making every resource stretch to its limit. Where others saw dwindling firewood, survivors saw the chance to double its value with nothing more than time and attention. Would you prepare firewood this way if it meant lasting through the cold? Subscribe and uncover more survival wisdom history has buried. Number 8. Salt-heated containers. In the long winters of World War II, when firewood ran out and coal was reduced to a handful of rations, people searched for anything that could store warmth longer than ordinary water. What many discovered was an unlikely ally: salt. Salt's natural density and heat-retaining properties made it an improvised substitute for modern heating packs. Families collected salt into tins, glass jars, or sealed cloth bags, then placed them near stoves, hearths, or even the embers of small fires. Once heated, the containers stayed warm for hours, releasing steady heat far longer than plain water would. Placed beneath bedding or tucked into coats, these salt-filled packs kept children from shivering through icy nights. The brilliance of this method was its reuse. Unlike fuel that vanished once burned, salt could be reheated again and again without losing its effectiveness. A family with only a few kilograms of salt could transform it into a renewable source of warmth, stretching their fuel supply dramatically. In some households, multiple jars were rotated through the day, one heating, one in use, creating a cycle of warmth without constant flames. Soldiers also used the trick in the field. Metal ration tins were filled with salt, sealed tightly, and set close to campfires until hot. The glowing container was then carried inside jackets or placed in dugouts, functioning as a durable hand warmer. Unlike embers, it produced no smoke, no flame, and little risk, perfect for concealment during long watches. But this technique wasn't without flaws. Salt containers could crack glass if overheated, or scorch cloth if left unwrapped. Overexposure to moisture also reduced their efficiency, clumping the grains and limiting heat storage. Despite these challenges, with care and repetition, it became one of the most dependable non-fuel heating systems available. What today seems like a curiosity was, in wartime, a quiet form of resilience. Salt, the same substance once valued for preserving food, became a silent guardian of warmth when all else failed. Number 9. Dung fuel hearths. When woodlands were stripped bare and coal stores vanished during World War II, rural families turned to one of the oldest heating fuels known to humankind: dried animal dung. What was once considered waste became a dependable energy source, sustaining households through winters when no other fuel remained. The process was straightforward but laborious. Fresh dung from cattle, horses, or donkeys was mixed with straw, leaves, or chopped stalks. This blend was pressed into flat cakes or small bricks, then left to dry under the sun for days until hard. Once cured, the blocks burned slowly with a steady glow, producing enough heat to warm a room or cook a simple meal. Dung fuel hearths were especially valuable because they consumed resources that were otherwise free. In villages where every scrap of wood was fought over, families with livestock had a renewable supply of heating fuel. These hearths also produced less visible flame, which meant warmth without drawing attention in dangerous or blackout conditions. The efficiency lay in their longevity. Unlike twigs that flared and died quickly, dung bricks smoldered for hours, keeping embers alive long after the firewood was gone. Some families buried the glowing blocks under ash to preserve heat overnight, waking to embers that could be rekindled easily in the morning. Of course, there were drawbacks. Dung fuel carried a strong odor, especially if not fully dried. It produced more ash than wood and required frequent cleaning of stoves or hearths. Storage also demanded dry space, since damp bricks became useless. Yet, for those with no other options, these inconveniences mattered little compared to the security of steady heat. This method reveals the stark pragmatism of wartime survival. Families looked past discomfort, turning what others dismissed into a lifeline. In a time when warmth meant endurance, even the humblest resource could become precious. The people of World War II survived winters not with abundance, but with invention, and they turned rubble into radiators and waste into fire, and the earth itself into warmth. Every method we've explored was born from desperation, yet shaped by resilience. Proof that survival depends less on resources and more on the will to adapt. Today, in our heated homes and electric blankets, these skills seem distant, almost unnecessary. But history whispers a warning. Systems can fail, supplies can vanish, and in those moments, the knowledge of how to keep warmth alive without fuel could decide more than comfort. It could decide endurance. What was once routine for families in crisis is now nearly forgotten. Yet by remembering, we inherit their strength. By practicing, we preserve their resilience. And by valuing these forgotten skills, we ensure that if hardship ever returns, we are not helpless. If you found even one of these methods eye-opening, let this not be the end of your journey. Subscribe now, and keep walking with me into the lost survival wisdom that history tried to bury. Because in these lessons lies not just the past, but the blueprint for endurance in any future.